Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. It's time we take a look at the war. The 9 Years' War. We've been dancing around the edges of this thing for a while now, but it's where we're going to live moving forward. The story of the pirates in this conflict all takes place on the fringes, but today we're going to jump right into the thick of it. To look at the causes of this war, though, is almost futile. If you look close enough, you can go back to the 100 Years' War, or take it back to Charlemagne, or the Norman invasion of England, or if you really want to go there, the Roman Empire and, the Teutoburger Wald. The conflict between France and Germany goes back into the mists of prehistory. That conflict lasted throughout almost all of recorded history until right about 1945. But we're not going to go into all of that, or the Reformation, or the Wars of Religion, or the 30 Years' War, or the 3 Anglo-Dutch Wars. Instead, I'm just going to remind you of the players that are active on this stage. On the one side, you have King Louis XIV of France, and on the other, you have everyone else. This is episode 172, the Williamite War. I would like to go back and point to a few key moments that lead up to this war, though. If you look back to the 1500s and the Barbary Corsairs, you will remember the Corsair leader Hereden Barbarossa. You'll remember that he was forced to winter 1 year on the Atlantic coast of France. During that winter, Barbarossa laid the groundwork for a Franco-Ottoman alliance that would last, in varying levels of officiality, until Napoleon Bonaparte. That long-lasting alliance might explain why King Louis chose not to join the Holy League when the Ottoman Turks invaded in 1686. That was the last great advance of the Ottomans into, I was going to say Europe, but that's complicated. Nearly all of the forces that fought in that war were themselves European. Longtime listeners will remember our discussion of Vlad Dracula and the Golden Horde and their distant descendants marching all the way to the gates of Vienna. Now the Holy League rallied Catholic armies from Germany and Austria, Poland, Hungary, even Spain and Portugal. All of the Catholic powers came together to fight the Turk. Just like the old days, right? Except France didn't join the fight, which is very unlike the old days. Instead, King Louis embarked on the War of the Reunions, which boils down to the French stabbing the rest of Catholic Europe in the back. Instead of riding for Vienna, France invaded the Rhineland. Now, the schism between Paris and Rome could be traced back to any number of locations, most notably the Great Schism. But the tension between this particular pope, Innocent XI, and King Louis of France could most directly be traced back to that decision. This particular act of treachery infuriated the Vatican, as well as their primary ally on earth, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. Now, Leopold could be, and often is, characterized as Louis's arch-nemesis. He is the leader that challenged France most frequently and with the most success. He's a Habsburg patriarch who should have been the most powerful person in the world. Leopold was the controlling interest in Germany and Austria and Spain, which of course gives him most of the New World, but for some reason, he still played second fiddle to King Louis. In part, that has to do with Spain's gradual decline and the separation of the Portuguese Empire from that of the Spanish, but really it has to do with France's ascendancy. Compared to the rest of the world, France was one of the most unified and cohesive political bodies that existed. It was on a par with the Ottoman Empire or the Chinese or the Mughal Empire before the European powers began to peck at her. Louis XIV, along with his ministers like Cardinal Mazarin and Jean-Baptiste Colbert, they got France into tip-top shape. They had the highest birth rate in Europe, along with the most dominant economy. But most importantly, and this is key, France's culture was hegemonic. Everyone in Europe spoke French. Everyone hired artists and artisans and architects from Paris if they could afford it. If they couldn't, they hired architects who copied the French style. Opera, theater, literature, philosophy, political theory, poetry, the very best was coming out of Paris. The Italians and the Austrians would have disagreed with that assessment, but they were wrong. Most English people probably would have begrudgingly admitted that to be the case, but they had their own personal grievances with the French, which naturally is why they invited William III, Prince of Orange, to come over and invade England, to take the throne. So let's dig in. We're not going to spend much time on the continent, though. The first year of continental warfare wasn't really that interesting, nor was it very important, at least to our story. Picture a bunch of rich kids. I think about like a bully from an 80s high school movie. You know, a convertible and perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a white suit. Only these particular rich kids have those giant, inbred Habsburg chins. Well, picture a group of kids like that riding around a battlefield in gleaming plate mail armor, swinging their swords, looking very noble and dashing. Meanwhile, a couple of 100 yards away, real soldiers are fighting the real battle. There's smoke, and there's blood, and there's fire, and limbs are being lost, and lives are being lost, but meanwhile, the important people up on the hill aren't taking a scratch. This was happening up and down the Rhine. But all of that, it's just too noble for me. You know, I'm looking for a story with a bit of backstabbing and intrigue. I want some double dealing. And it's here, to be found, just not on the continent. For that, we have to look elsewhere, and we're going to begin today in Ireland. Generally, the war in Ireland, the theater of the 9 Years' War that took place in Ireland and very northern England, is called the Williamite War, after William III. However, some people still today refer to it as the Jacobite War, after, naturally, James II. Those were the leaders of the two sides of this conflict, and there are political factions today that still use the name of this war to try and imply blame. But to say that James was really in charge here is not exactly accurate. He was only kind of in charge of the Jacobite army. Let's break down who exactly was fighting for King James. There were a few thousand Englishmen who were undeniably Jacobite loyalists, men who followed King James into exile and then followed him to Ireland. They were his, body and soul. But then there were about 6,000 French troops. Now those were Louis's men, not James's. But some of them did have an interest in England. Many of them owned an English estate or had trading concerns with the English that might be disrupted should William stay on the throne. So they chose to fight for King James. Now that's a small number of troops, but it's something we shouldn't minimize. The French were busy invading the Rhineland. Those 6,000 troops could have been used elsewhere to great effect, but Louis thought that this particular theater was important enough to invest them. However, the vast majority of the troops that fought in the Williamite War on the side of King James were Irish forces. Those are the troops that really interest me today, mostly because this conflict will highlight the divisions that were already present in Irish society. Right now, there are a bunch of Irish sailors who are active in this bout of fighting. Names like William Burke and Robert Glover. Names that most of us probably don't yet know, but we will. They're going to turn pirate in only a couple of years. They're going to be sailing alongside the likes of Captain Kidd and Henry Avery. And then there are other names. Now, the most famous Irish pirate, probably the most famous, Anne Bonny, was not yet born. She would be born by the end of the 9 Years' War, but she was a small child through all of the fighting. However, these divisions would still have been present and would have formed her view of the world. But there is one other name I would like to note. There was a young boy, 6 or 7 years old at the time, running around Ireland when this war broke out. His name was Edward Seaguard, which is a name most of you probably don't know, but he will be known by a different, much more famous name, Edward England. There are a ton of Irish pirates in the story to come, and this is the world that will create them. The Irish Jacobites were Jacobites. They were willing, eager even, to take up arms in favor of James Stuart. but their motivations for doing so are complicated. To understand those motivations, we need to take a look at the man they were fighting for. Not King James, but his agent in Ireland, a man named Richard Talbot. The Irish Jacobite forces were undeniably Talbot's army. The Talbot family was among the most prominent Irish Catholic families in the lead-up to the English Civil War. The Talbots, like virtually anybody else who supported the Stuarts and any Catholic families in England, suffered terribly during the Cromwellian regime. If you think back to John Churchill, who, at this point in our story, is the Earl of Marlborough, you'll see a lot of similarities there between Talbot and Churchill. Both came from families loyal to the Stuarts who suffered during Cromwell's reign and then prospered quite a bit when the Stuarts were restored. In Talbot's case, when Charles took the throne, he was raised the first Earl of Tyrconnell, and then he was named the Lord Deputy of Ireland. In plainer terms, he was the Viceroy of Ireland. However, he wasn't some outsider foisted on the Irish people. The Talbot family hailed from Ireland, and Richard Talbot was raised a Catholic. The Irish Catholic majority of Ireland mostly liked him. Even the Protestants living up north more or less liked Talbot, at least they were able to work with him. Do you recall Sarah Churchill? I called her the First Lady of England, Marlborough's wife. If you think back to her story, she was made one of Anne Hyde's maids of honor. Anne Hyde being James' first wife, the Duchess of York. You might recall that Sarah was made a maid of honor only when her older sister caused a minor scandal there at court when she engaged in an affair with a slightly older, married Catholic man. That slightly older, married Catholic man was Richard Talbot. You can see why that might cause a scandal. That older sister, Frances Jennings, was married off to a good Protestant boy to cover it up. However, a couple of funerals later, Frances Jennings was free to marry as she pleased without her husband or father getting in the way. Now, this all coincides perfectly with that coven of witches in King Louis's court. That coven who became so infamous for providing poison to the noble ladies of the French court to kill their husbands and fathers and whoever else might be getting in their way. Poison was suspected here in the case of Frances Jennings, but nonetheless, she was free to marry her old flame, Talbot. All that is to say, Frances Jennings married Talbot and became the First Lady of Ireland, while her younger sister, Sarah, married Churchill and began the road to becoming the First Lady of England. Do I think that these two women were involved in a clandestine conspiracy of covens of witches between Ireland, England, and France that put themselves in positions of power? No, as much as I'd like to. I think that their family was well connected and these women were politically savvy enough to get themselves where they needed to be. But the role of these women in this story should not be understated. Not just this story of the 9 Years' War or the Williamite War, but the rest of our whole story of pirates and piracy. These two Jennings women and their very close associates, Queen Mary and the future Queen Anne, are the primary political movers and shakers of this whole era. Now, I don't want to paint their husbands as a bunch of doofuses, this isn't a bad sitcom. They were all formidable in their own right. But those four women are responsible for a ton of policy decisions that are going to hugely impact our story. Now, of course, this is probably the case throughout most of history, but we don't have documentation of that fact. Here, we do. These four women wrote each other letters all the time. While their husbands were unable to have any sort of official diplomatic contact since they were often at war with each other, these four women were able to write each other letters and provide a sort of back channel that really illuminates the whole era. So, Lord Tyrconnell and his wife were mostly well-liked in Ireland, but there was some tension there. The north of Ireland, what is today Northern Ireland, had a relatively large population of English Protestants. There were landowners and landlords. Beneath that, there was a relatively large middle class of English Protestant merchants. And then on the bottom, there was a largish lower class of Irish Catholics. This Division in Irish society was readily apparent to everyone at the time and was causing problems. There was this policy of shifting control of the land and natural resources of Ireland away from the families that had controlled it for centuries and into the hand of English Protestants. For the most minor offenses you can imagine, a Catholic landowner might have their land taken by the government and handed off to an Englishman. Now both King James and Lord Tyrconnell were complicit in this state of affairs. They profited from it in huge amounts, but they managed to avoid a lion's share of the blame here. They were able to shift nearly all of the blame away from themselves and onto that vile parliament that was putting political pressure on them. We see this kind of thing constantly in the modern world. Whenever a president or a prime minister fails to come through on a campaign promise, they can always blame it on the obstructionist Congress or the Parliament or whoever can take the blame without them taking a political hit. We see this everywhere. However, somehow, they still manage to get the job done for all of their wealthy donors. This is not new. It was in full effect here in Ireland. And just like we realize that it's happening, the Irish were aware of it as well. They knew that King James and Lord Tyrconnell were pulling the wool over their eyes, but having an Irish Catholic in Tyrconnell's place, someone who fought for them on some issues, was better than having some English Protestant who would keep them under his boot. But then William III invaded. King James was ousted, and initially Tyrconnell supported the new king. He was, after all, merely a viceroy of England, and his support for William saved his position. But all the while, he was making moves behind the scenes. And then James informed him of his plans to make a landing in Ireland. Tyrconnell ordered his fellow Catholic lords secretly to rouse their forces for the Jacobite cause. Now the force that they raised was formidable, but internally they were divided. The Irish who supported King James all had very different reasons for doing so. Some believed that a restored King James could cow the Parliament. Now that he had a victory in the field, he could dictate terms to them. In that scenario, Ireland's Catholic majority could prosper. There were others, though, who were outright Irish nationalists. They believed, thanks to a few suggestions made by Tyrconnell, though not promises, but they believed that a restored King James would free Ireland from English authority, that he would make the Earl a new Irish king. And it looks like Tyrconnell may have actually believed this was a possibility. But if he did, that is just the worst kind of naivete. King James was, in almost every respect, a king in the mold of the Sun King. His sole goal was power, so much so that, despite being a Catholic himself, he saw the church as a bar to his own power. Both Louis and James were in the habit of appointing their own bishops, independent of any kind of papal authority. Nobody else was doing this, and the Vatican hated it. It personally infuriated the Pope. It infuriated him so much that, well, I want to preface this. This little tidbit only came out a few years ago, and it's still somewhat controversial. There are some recently revealed Vatican records that show us that Pope Innocent XI clandestinely funded the invasion of William III. The Pope paid a Protestant king to invade England and overthrow a Catholic, which, aside from any religious implications here, has a lot more to do with power itself. The Habsburgs, who were joined at the hip with the Vatican, hated King Louis and therefore hated his ally, James II. Regardless, James was never going to relinquish control over Ireland to anyone. But the Irish nationalists did not yet know that. For the time being, they put James in a very strong position. He had this surge of support in Ireland, and he had a strong base there in Scotland. Remember, his family came from Scotland originally. Not to mention, he had the support of France. Essentially, they had England surrounded. The only lifeline the English had was the crossing to the Netherlands. If you'll forgive a bit of armchair generalship here, there is a world in which, had King James taken the time to secure his bases of power in Ireland and Scotland, he could have choked England. He could have choked the support for William away. It would still have been a tough fight. The Scottish don't have the population, the Irish don't have the ships to compare with what the English had, but there's a world in which it could have worked. However, that's not what James did. Instead, even before he landed in Ireland, he ordered almost 40% of all of the Irish soldiers that had been raised by Tyrconnell to make a landing in England. Now I can see why he might have done so, and we'll discuss that in a minute, but looking back on it, well, you can choose your favorite aphorism here. Personally, I like putting the cart before the horse. Sending so many of his troops over to England seriously weakened James' position in Ireland, and Ireland, though largely behind him, was not yet won. Those English Protestants in the north, Williamites, all of them, roused what's called the Army of the North. This would prove to be James' downfall, although at the time he didn't know it. When he landed in Ireland on the 9th of March, 1689, James' military position was still good. His forces in Ireland outnumbered the Williamites. He had a toehold in England with Scotland to their rear. And there, in March of 1689, it looked like William III might just play right into his plans. William was not even in England at the time. He'd sailed back to Amsterdam, where he was orchestrating the war against France. I mean, that was the main stage here. His wife, Mary, was still in England, but she had very little say over military matters. There was a moment where it looked like William was going to let the British fight this thing out on their own and then sweep in and clean up the leftovers. But the Earl of Marlborough, John Churchill, saw the flaw in this plan and sailed to Amsterdam to personally speak to William and tell him what a bad idea it was. If William ignored this Irish battlefield, he would lose the support of the Irish Protestants. Therefore, he would lose Ireland, and that would virtually hand Ireland and Scotland to King James, who, as we said, would have England surrounded. This plan, Marlborough alleged, would see London besieged within a year. William saw the wisdom here, and he sighed and sailed for Ireland. The fighting that followed isn't going to concern us here today. The tactics and strategy used in the Williamite War have virtually nothing to do with pirates, at least in this early stage. We will talk more about tactics next time, but for now, mostly we're looking at sieges and a few large-ish but indecisive battles. Overall, the war seemed to favor the Jacobites, though. They won more than they lost, largely due to their numerical advantage. But as the weeks dragged on, even though the Jacobites continued to win most of their engagements, it was becoming clear that they couldn't keep it up. The force that James landed in England was defeated. And here is where I want to cut him a little slack on that. He landed those troops on English soil in an attempt to secure his supply routes. A beachhead in England would allow him to keep the Irish Sea clear. This was necessary because most of their supplies were supposed to be coming from France. Louis was going to send them guns and food and shoes and troops. But now that they'd lost, they began to suffer shortages. The Jacobites had to lean harder and harder on the people of southern Ireland. For clothes and food and shoes, this was a burden, but it was possible. However, the people of Ireland, southern Ireland at least, had very little in the way of armaments. Shot and powder were in short supply. I mean, it's not like the English were going to let them arm themselves as they pleased. On the other hand, the North, who was populated, remember, by English Protestants, was really well supplied. They had all the food and warm clothes and shot and powder and new muskets and good boots that they could wish for. In a mere few weeks, the situation for the Irish Jacobites began to look hopeless. And everybody saw that. all of those Irish nationalists began to question just what they were fighting for. Were they fighting to put James on the throne and therefore subjugate themselves to the English, or were they fighting for an independent Ireland? Had James been willing to take that hit, had he come right out and said, "Yeah, put me on the thrones of Scotland and England and I'll free the Irish," had he done that, he might have been able to win this war. Maybe, if that were the case, he could have turned the tide of the entire 9 Years' War. I mean, maybe not. It was still an underdog fight, but at least we would probably get a whole lot of revolutionary pirate stuff out of it. Breaking blockades and attacking the Navy in clandestine nighttime raids, Grace O'Malley come again, that kind of thing. But he did not. James dithered on his claim to Ireland, and thus his support from the Irish nationalist faction just melted away. They began to desert his army in huge numbers. They started engaging in guerrilla warfare against, yes, the English Protestants, but also the Jacobites. Anyone on Irish soil fighting against their cause was an enemy. The fighting was far from over in this war, but who was going to win was no longer in question. The Earl of Tyrconnell pulled his support for the war. He began arguing for a negotiated settlement with King William. James deserted his Jacobite army and he fled back to France. That was his last real contribution to the war effort. The rest of his life would be spent in exile. King William, realizing this war was won, returned to the Continental Front. He sent Marlborough in to mop things up. Now, Marlborough would go on to prove himself and some of his radical military ideas in what was quickly devolving into essentially an Irish civil war. He did so well that William would have preferred to use his services elsewhere, but he was unable to, because even though everybody knew that this war was over, King Louis kept it going. He kept this trickle of money and guns and propaganda flowing slowly but flowing into Scotland and Ireland. It was never enough, you understand. He never sent the good stuff. A ship with a few dozen old, out-of-repair muskets, a couple of bushels of wheat, and a few bags of coin. Just enough to keep the Jacobites limping along. But he also sent his assurances, promising that he had Ireland's best interest at heart. It wasn't much, and it certainly wasn't enough to win, but it was enough to keep that hard core of Irish revolutionaries fighting. They were enough, with France's support, to divert English soldiers away from the front and to Ireland. And that story is kind of fun. We get to see some of Marlborough's tactics at use. We get to see the drama between the two Jennings women. But it is, in the big picture at least, a sidebar to our story. So there, for now at least, we're going to leave Ireland behind. When we were discussing the Irish theater of the 9 Years' War, I didn't talk much about the tactics they used, or even the greater strategic moves. How kings and dukes and generals chose to prosecute their war doesn't matter, but why they did so does. However, today we are going to look a little bit more at the tactical moves in our theater and the strategic moves on a much smaller scale. If you've ever seen the Mel Gibson movie The Patriot, they make a big deal about adopting Native American battle tactics. There is some historical basis for that, but as usual, Mel Gibson took the real history and manipulated the facts to his own cinematic ends. I mean, it's not like after 200 years in North America and a bunch of wars fought against and alongside Native Americans, the English hadn't already figured that out. Today we're going to be looking at one of those wars, the American theater of the 9 Years' War, and the dawn of one of the largest conflicts in early American colonial history. This is episode 173, King William's War. When last we left New England, it was shortly after the outbreak of the 9 Years' War, but we haven't really done a circuit of the colonial landscape for quite some time. You know, historically speaking, what did the colonies look like in 1689? Well, by that point it looked similar, although not exactly the same, to what it would look like about 100 years later at the Revolution. We should note the Restoration colonies, established by Charles II upon the Stuart Restoration. The big two there were Pennsylvania, named after Admiral Sir William Penn, and the Carolina colony. Now, neither is going to concern us today, but I do want to make a note of them. They were both major economic players, and especially Carolina is going to concern us moving forward. The colonial charters in both cases were given to close allies of Charles II. Carolina especially enjoyed a certain royal preference. The capital of Carolina, Charlestown, was, in addition to being named after Charles, occasionally the largest city in the colonies. Not always, in fact, not even most of the time. Boston and New York, Jamestown, they were all big cities, but there were a lot of slaves in Carolina, and many of them in Charlestown itself. The southern colonies aren't really going to be impacted by King William's War, but we should keep Carolina and Georgia in the back of our minds. The other new major colony of note was New York. We've talked about New York a lot already. It was giving Boston a run for its money. The real point of interest there are the other new colonies in New York's sphere of influence. New Jersey, Delaware, parts of Connecticut, what they would call the middle colonies. In that respect, in that there were southern colonies, middle colonies, and New England, the map looked a lot like it would on the eve of Revolution. But 3 colonies concern us today: New York, New Hampshire, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Those 3 all had borders that were, in 1689, still in flux. The most contentious region was the province of Maine, which belonged to Massachusetts. I say belonged, but I should amend that. Massachusetts claimed the province of Maine, but so did the French. And France is key to our story today, so let's take a quick jaunt through New France. There were 3 French colonies in North America at the time, although their borders were even less defined than the English colonies. Louisiana existed, for example, but it was still being explored at the time. The largest colony of the 3 was called Canada. The province of Canada was giant, nothing compared to modern-day Canada, but huge nonetheless. However, much like the Louisiana Territory, Canada was lightly populated by the French. Most of the inhabitants of Canada were Cree people. The French lived primarily in 2 settlements, Quebec and Mount Royal, or Montreal. Both were large, populous fort cities. Now, you might be wondering, what about Toronto? Well, hold on to that, we're getting there. The province of Canada claimed parts of 2 different English colonies, the very far north of New Hampshire and the western reaches of New York. Now, both of those regions will see a good bit of fighting, but this war that we're concerned with today broke out between Massachusetts and the French province of Acadia. Today, Acadia is a peninsula in Nova Scotia with a ton of Atlantic coastline, almost an island, but not quite. At the time, though, it was one of the most important strategic locations in the entire northwestern hemisphere, arguably the most important on all the Atlantic coast. The province of Acadia included the modern-day Acadian Peninsula, as well as Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and most of Maine. If you take a look at a map of that region, you'll note that all of those territories are necessary to control the entrance to the St. Lawrence River and access to the Great Lakes region. This was of major economic importance to the French Empire. The Acadian Peninsula, the part of the peninsula that connects with the rest of mainland Canada, was home to a fort city called Port Royal. Or, I suppose, Port Royal. In its strategic value, I think of it kind of as an Istanbul or Constantinople. It was placed in a similar fashion, on a very narrow strip of land where the peninsula met the rest of mainland Canada. Port Royal was settled by the French way back in 1613. It was pretty quickly taken over by the Scottish, who controlled it for a number of years, and then it was in English hands for a while, but by 1689 it was back in the hands of the French. Now, Port Royal will see some naval action in the upcoming war, but more than that, it was a base for land action in southern Acadia, also known as Maine. Before that, though, we should introduce the two indigenous peoples who will play a role in this war. I keep calling it the American theater of the 9 Years' War, and it was, but really, the 9 Years' War just gave the European powers in America an opportunity to fight openly, rather than their long-running proxy war fought through their Indian allies. There was the Iroquois Confederacy, an alliance that was distinct from the Iroquois peoples. It consisted of 5 nations that were allied with the English. Their enemies, the Wabanaki Confederacy, were an Algonquin confederation that was allied with the French. Now, these two groups had been fighting since before European contact. The Europeans, though, got involved as soon as they arrived, and they called this conflict between the Iroquois and the Wabanaki the Beaver Wars. Now, that war picked up pace significantly in 1681. When England took control of New Netherland, it created yet another border between France and England, in a region that already had a ton of friction between the native tribes there. In 1681, the French authorized the sale of weapons to the Wabanaki people, and the governor of French Canada, the Comte de Frontenac, negotiated an official alliance with the Wabanaki. This reignited the proxy war. While the Wabanaki and the Iroquois had been fighting for a long time, this brought the European powers back into the fold. I'll give an example of how that war could go. In 1686, the Iroquois Confederation made a big move. There was a large migration of people from all of the different nations of the Confederacy, though mostly Mohawk and Seneca people, that marched deep into Wabanaki territory. They established a settlement there. Now, this was a migration. Thousands of people, families, women, children, old people, they moved in and settled down on that piece of land. They built a village, they planted crops, all of that. But on the other hand, this was also a military invasion. Those who made that march were warriors. They had to be, because the piece of land they chose was not empty. The Wabanaki had a pretty significant trading post there. It's a perfect place to build one. It's the site of modern-day Toronto. This was an immensely important location in the beaver trade, and I can't overstate what a big deal the beaver trade was. You know how pirates down south in the West Indies were always hoping for silver or, better yet, gold, maybe jewels. More often, though, they found sugar, which was fine, but sometimes they would happen across a haul of indigo or nutmeg, maybe. Not as convenient as hard money, but worth almost as much. Beaver pelts, similar to indigo or nutmeg, fall into that same category. Usually you're going to find codfish, mostly just codfish, but sometimes you'll find a bale of beaver skin. Now, the French had this market mostly cornered, thanks to their Wabanaki allies and their deeply important trading posts, such as Toronto. This move by the Iroquois in 1686 was a major coup. In retaliation, though, the French invaded western New York and attacked the Seneca people who were living there. Now, the English and the French both took part in this war, active military participation, but they rarely attacked each other. They usually only attacked indigenous settlements. What they were doing was playing this complex game of plausible deniability. But then, of course, there is a thick layer of racist icing on the whole cake. Whenever a group of native peoples would invade and engage in burning and looting and torture and rape and murder, they were painted as savages, heathens, the worst kind of barbarians. But then, when the Europeans did exactly the same thing, usually on a much larger scale, they were only doing it against heathenist barbarians. It was a preemptive strike, obviously. What this did was allow the French and English to fight by proxy even when they were at peace. But everyone knew this couldn't last. A real fight had to be coming. In that same year, 1686, the French built 3 churches in the province of Maine. They were Catholic missions built at 3 separate Algonquin villages. Now, they were genuine religious institutions. The priests there were real priests. They were there to minister to the local peoples. But they were on the frontier. Naturally, as frontier settlements, you have to have a few muskets, for protection. But then you look closer. There were usually maybe as many as a couple dozen Frenchmen there, but they would have hundreds of muskets and pikes and powder and shot and supplies. These were religious institutions, but they also served as forward bases. Not forts filled with French troops, but supply depots for Indian allies and a small cadre of French commanders. Now keep in mind that in 1686 the French and the English were at peace. They were allies back then. Even still, though, the French built these missions. Now don't think it's all French aggression here. The English were building their own forward bases, and they were fully manned forts. The closest to those 3 missions is a place we've seen before, just down the coast. You will, of course, remember Fort Loyal at Falmouth, Maine. It's the same fort we paid a visit to alongside Thomas Pound in 1689, when his ship's doctor seduced away 20 or 30 of the militiamen there, and then he laughed in the commander's face. Here in 1686, though, that fort was already a problem. It was a point of contention. The whole province of Maine was a problem, though. It was claimed by both powers, but to the French, Fort Loyal looked aggressive. It was aggressive. Hence, 3 Catholic missions led by Catholic priests with hundreds of muskets each. In April of 1688, before the outbreak of the war in Europe, war was already breaking out in America. Governor Edmund Andros, who would be out as governor in only a couple of months, he led the men of Fort Loyal to the southernmost of those Catholic missions. That mission was on the Kennebec River. The English called it Norridgewick, and everyone else called it Kennebec. Kennebec was home to one Father Jean-Vincent de Abadie de Saint-Castin. He was the leader of the mission there. He was also a celebrated military commander back in France. Andros, though, attacked and plundered his mission and killed some of the Algonquins and carried off the spoils, but really this isn't about money. This is about sending a message. The English drove that message home when they marched on to a nearby Indian village that was home to all the women of the tribe. Then they turned around and went back to Fort Loyal. Now, if you read the English records, they'll tell you that it is at this point that hostilities commenced. All the fault of the French, of course. Father Castin attacked an English settlement inland from Fort Loyal. He had a dozen of his own Frenchmen with him and 250 Abenaki warriors, members of the Wabanaki Confederacy. I say he had a dozen of his own men, but really those Abenaki warriors were his men as well. Jean Castin was a war chief to the Abenaki people. What follows is called the Northeast Coast Campaign. Father Castin and his army of Abenaki warriors marched on every English settlement along the coast and defiled them. It's more of the same. Murder, fire, torture, rape, complete desolation. And that sounds horrible, and it is horrible, but it's really no different from what Andros had just done a couple of months earlier. This was the norm. Now, we can assume that the fighting would have continued on in that fashion for some time, but everything changed in late 1688 when William invaded England and Louis invaded the Rhineland. England and France were officially at war, and in America, the gloves came off. As soon as the weather warmed in spring of 1689, the French and their Wabanaki forces turned up the heat. They invaded northern New Hampshire, captured somewhere around 30 women and children, and killed 40 men. Not Iroquois, but English citizens. This was an open act of warfare. The rescue party that the English sent out to bring back the captives and bury the dead was never heard from again, nor were those women and children. It's here I'd like to talk about the tactics used in this war. Early modern warfare is often characterized as a bunch of guys standing in rows across fields firing muskets at one another, and that's not exactly inaccurate, but it's not really fair either. That doesn't take into account siegecraft or cavalry or artillery, not to mention, naval warfare. But in America, at the time, things were different. First of all, the forces were tiny. 500 soldiers was a big force, and that was almost never European soldiers, it was almost always Indian allies. Now, you might be able to talk a couple hundred Europeans into standing across a field and firing muskets at each other, but good luck talking Mohawk warriors into that. The tactics utilized by those Indian allies were stealth and surprise and hit-and-run raids. They look a lot like pirate tactics. Or, Robin Hood. It's how you fight when you have a small force of people who will be needed to grow food or sail your ship when all this is over. It also helps when you don't have some duke who doesn't care if you live or die telling you how to fight. The colonists in America picked up on that pretty quickly, as did the pirates who came from this region, and we see them in full effect in this theater of war. Everyone was using these tactics on both sides, but the English credit one particular Rhode Island commander for implementing them. His name was Benjamin Church. Church was one of the first generation of American-born Englishmen. He was born in Plymouth, the son of Mayflower passengers. He served in the Colonial militia his entire life. Early on, he fought alongside Native American warriors and learned about that style of warfare. He knew, in fact, a lot more about this style of combat than traditional European warfare. When this conflict began, the Council of the Plymouth Colony promoted him to major and sent him out at the head of a force of 250 English soldiers. Now, this was a direct response to Thomas Pound's actions at Fort Loyal. When Thomas Pound seduced away those soldiers on the 8th of August, the people of Massachusetts realized they just didn't have the soldiers to properly man that fort. So they wrote the Providence Colony and a few others to ask them for help, but Providence responded with a good number of militiamen and Benjamin Church. On the 20th of September, about a week after Church and his men arrived, scouts showed up with word that an attack on the fort was imminent. Major Church ordered all of the non-military settlers in the region into Fort Loyal behind their walls, and then he prepared his men for battle. Now, most of these soldiers were in a defensive formation behind earthen fortifications. But then he dispatched 2 units into nearby thickets on either side of the clearing at which this fighting would take place. These are Native American tactics we have seen implemented by many a pirate in the past. This is what Mel Gibson was talking about in The Patriot, but here we see it a full century before the Revolution. The force that arrived come dawn was made up entirely of Wabanaki warriors. It was smaller than Major Church's 250, but big enough to pose a threat. The fight that followed proved harder than it should have been, especially given Major Church's advantages. One of the groups that had been sent out to ambush the invaders was spotted. A group of Wabanaki scouts flanked these ambushers, sneaked up behind them, and slit their throats. The English soldiers who expected that flank to be secure turned their backs on the tree line. When the main body of Wabanaki rushed the barricades, those scouts opened fire on the English. Of course, the English still had that other unit in the other tree line. The Wabanaki found themselves caught in the crossfire, and soon enough they pulled back from the field. We don't have Wabanaki casualty numbers, but 21 Englishmen were killed in that engagement. The people of Falmouth were safe. Behind the walls of Fort Loyal, they all lived on to see another day. But then Major Church did something odd. He left. A few days after his victory, maybe as much as a couple of weeks, he sailed to Boston. It looks like he received orders to return, but we don't have copies of those orders, if in fact they did exist, for reasons that will soon become clear. Here's what happened from the French point of view. Father Jean Castan heard word that Thomas Pound had sailed up, seduced away those soldiers, and left Fort Loyal weak. So, seeing this opportunity, he sent out a relatively small unit of Wabanaki tribesmen to attack the fort. But, upon their attack, they found 250 Englishmen waiting there to repel their forces. 250 soldiers is a sizable force for that region at that time. Enough that it freaked out the French. That's an invasion force. That's enough soldiers to potentially take all 3 of those French missions. That's enough to take Maine. In the face of this existential threat, Father Castan, a Wabanaki war chief, gathered a force of maybe 250 or even 300 Wabanaki warriors. Then he sent word to his top lieutenant, Joseph Francois, who raised his own force of 200 or 300. The records of Joseph Francois, at least his early life, are somewhat sparse, but we should note him. He was captured by Iroquois allied to the English when he was a young boy. He learned their language and learned to live among them. But he escaped the Iroquois only to live with the Wabanaki for a couple of years, learning their language and living among them before, as a young teenager, finally returning home. While the English may give Major Church all the credit for introducing Native American tactics into this war, Joseph Francois deserves just as much, if not more. In May of 1690, he joined up with Father Castan to form a force of 400 or 500 or even 600 soldiers. That's a large force, certainly enough to crush the 250 Englishmen who were absolutely, definitely still at Fort Loyal, right? I wonder if, when all this is over, if Father Castan turned to whomever was in charge of that first Wabanaki raid, standing in front of a literal pile of bodies, and asked him exactly where those 250 men were. I would love to tell you about the Battle of Fort Loyal. You know, a hard-bitten fight between 2 powerful adversaries, but I can't. Instead, I'm going to have to tell you about the Falmouth massacre. The people of Falmouth, when they realized that this raid was incoming, did make it inside the walls. They did take up guns, and they did try to defend themselves. But it was in vain. Maybe 50 or 60 civilians with 20 or 30 militiamen versus maybe as many as 600 warriors. Every person inside Fort Loyal was either killed or captured that day. A mountain of bodies was piled before the gates of Fort Loyal. When Major Church arrived a few weeks later, it took him several days, with all of his troops working overtime, to bury all of them. Most of the women and children were carted away, but a few of the men were taken with them. One of those men managed to escape and tell the tales of what he experienced there. The men from Fort Loyal were stripped naked and forced to dance. Sure, that's humiliating, but whenever one of those men began to lag, he was beaten with clubs, one of them with an axe. All while enduring this suffering, the women and girls were being divided among the victors of that day's battle. When those men, bruised and bloodied, were unable to dance or even to stand, they were finally allowed to rest. They were tied up and given a sparse amount of water and no food. All throughout the night, they were forced to listen to the victorious soldiers enjoying their spoils. Come dawn, once again, they were forced to dance. 2 of the men managed to escape, but one of them, delirious from pain and hunger, fell back into Wabanaki hands. Only one eventually made it to Boston to tell this tale. Now, The question of blame here has been tossed around after this massacre quite a bit. Certainly, Major Church, or whoever ordered him to leave Fort Loyal, deserves a large amount of blame, but who you choose to blame has a lot to do with your prejudices. Was this massacre irrefutable proof that the French were violent dogs below contempt? Or was it a sign that the Indian people, even the allies of the English, were, the savage barbarians that they were so often painted as? The answer, of course, is neither. What happened here is something that we see all throughout history. We see it especially when people of different backgrounds come into conflict. Remember that march north that Governor Andros led only a few months earlier? Remember how, after defeating the Wabanaki warriors, he led his men to that nearby village to enjoy the spoils of victory. I don't want to go into detail here. The thought of it makes me sick to my stomach, but this was a force of 300 soldiers or more, marching on a village of women and children with far fewer inhabitants than that. Were you one of those defeated Wabanaki warriors, the likelihood that your wife and daughters were pregnant after the attentions of the English, if they survived, that is, the likelihood is high. That's something that you would have to live with. That's something that your wife and daughters would have to live with. And then, this Frenchman, this white war chief, gives you the opportunity for revenge. When the French commanders realized that there were not, in fact, 250 soldiers defending the walls, they did try to hold the Wabanaki back. They failed, but they didn't do so because they were good people. There are no good people in this story. But we have to look at this from a realpolitik point of view. The English had a total mastery of the sea, and this kind of brutality would elicit a response from them. It did elicit a response from them. I don't think it's a spoiler to point out that today, Maine is a state in the United States of America, not a Canadian province. However, the English Navy was busy at the moment. They didn't have the ships to spare to attack a few hundred Wabanaki tribesmen and a couple of dozen Frenchmen. So what would any good English colonial governor do when he needs the Navy, but the Navy isn't coming? He issues commissions, or letters of reprisal, or letters of marque, or whatever legal cover he needs to raise a citizen navy of privateers. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show, everybody who has signed up to become a patron on Patreon, anyone who has left us a rating or a review wherever you listen to the show, everybody who has donated through the website, and everybody who has recommended this show to your friends and family, online or in real life. All of you make it possible. Thank you. Our theme music was, as usual, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, you absolutely should do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au, that's brillig.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com. As always, most importantly, thank you for listening.